So our first training is going to cover the Rental Housing Board and provide a brief overview of the program and ordinance. So for the training topic specifically for the Housing Review Board, we're going to talk about the purpose of the board, specific powers and duties, membership, the meeting structure, petition and appeals hearing overview, so the process for hearing those petitions and potential appeals, and then a little bit about some of the future trainings. So first we're going to get into a background. How did we get here? So the Housing Protection Long-Term Rental Division's goal is to provide a balanced property owner fair return for their investment and to provide tenants with protections from unpermitted rent increases and evictions. So it's really in support of protecting tenants from the growing housing crisis with rising rents, but also understanding the owner's need for the right to a fair return. The Housing Protection Ordinance began with the Emergency Ordinance 1907. So it was adopted in March 5th of 2019, and it was just a 45-day moratorium that was limiting the rent increases. So it was an emergency ordinance. Then the Housing Protection Ordinance 2103 was adopted in November of 2019. This had specific caps for rent increases, and it was linked to the change in what's known as CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. So this is only applying to properties with 5 or more units, and it capped the rent increases at 3%. The Housing Protection Department, as a response, was created in May of 2020, and they're really overseeing all of the rules of the ordinance and making sure that you all have all of the resources needed to fulfill your duties as well. And the Housing Protection Ordinance and Just Cause Eviction Ordinance 2109 is the current adopted ordinance from May 2021. So you have that copy of the ordinance in, I believe, a packet for the board folders that you have, and that's what we're going to be pulling from for this training. So the Housing Protection Ordinance 2109, which is just cause eviction protections and the residential rent stabilization, only applies to rental units, but does not include mobile home parks. Those are under their own separate law, so just keep that in mind when we're reviewing this. So the first part of this ordinance is really related to the just cause eviction protections. So just cause evictions are really to make sure that tenants are not being evicted wrongfully, that there is the at fault or no fault. It lays out the guidelines for what qualifies for an at-fault eviction for a tenant and a no-fault eviction. So we're going to, it will discuss some exemptions from the ordinance and then specific procedures that are needed to be followed by the owner for termination of tenancy. And if any of those procedures are not followed that are laid out within the ordinance, that is in violation of the tenant's rights. And it also covers relocation assistance and describes specifically when that's applicable. So when you receive a petition from maybe a tenant that is saying that they were wrongfully evicted, you would refer to the just cause eviction protection language within the ordinance, and you'll have very clear guidelines for what is allowed and what is not allowed for all of those different circumstances. One of the no-fault examples could be that an owner is going to be needs to move into that unit. So they would give them a certain amount of days to vacate. So you have specific examples of what is allowed under the ordinance. The rent stabilization measures are separate part of the ordinance that is not dealing with the evictions and those tenant protections, but is really controlling the rent increases that are given to the tenants throughout the year and throughout the time of their tenancy. So as I stated previously, any multifamily and any property that has 5 or more rental units falls under the ordinance for the 3% cap, or the consumer price index. It's just known as CPI for the most part. Whichever is greater, that's what the owner is allowed to raise the rents for. For units that are in a complex with 4 or less units, 5% plus the CPI, or 10%, whichever is lower, applies. And so you might see petitions that come in, and you're going to have to look at the number of units in the property, and there will be a little bit of math involved in determining whether or not a rent increase was over the allowable amount. For the petition process, the ordinance also discusses how landlords and tenants are able to contest violations or seek rent adjustments, also known as petitions. So you have owner petitions and the landlord petitions. And we are going to go through those in detail when we continue on with this training module. Do you have a question, sir? Good question. So the tenant petitions are one thing, and then landlord or owner, the landlord is the owner. So those petitions are the same. So we were using those terms interchangeably, but good question. So it's owner of the property, AKA landlord of the property, so also known as landlord. Good question. And then the tenant is the person with the lease with the owner. So they all have their own set of petitions to contest parts of the ordinance. And like I said, the next trainings are going to cover in detail those specific petitions and how you would look at each of them. This is just a high-level overview. Before we continue with just how do we get here in the background, are there any questions? Okay, thank you. So the purpose, as we stated before, that we are really laying out the administration and the enforcement. The City of Inglewood Housing Protection Ordinance provides to all of the residents of the city. So the board's responsibilities are outlined in the following documents. So you have the Inglewood Municipal Code, the Rental Housing Board bylaws, which you all will be voting on today. And then we have the Housing Protection Ordinance itself, which has specific details on your roles and responsibilities. For powers and duties. So this is a hefty slide. You're keeping this PowerPoint as board members, so you'll be able to reference it as you are making some of your decisions moving forward in the future. But overall, the Rental Housing Board shall have the following powers and duties. So you are to have regular meetings at least once each calendar month as needed to review applications submitted by owners or tenants, whether it's related to the just cause eviction protection or the rent control regulations. And then you're going to be establishing the policies and procedures for administering and enforcing those regulations. And when you are conducting these appeals, you will reference all of the source documents, such as the applicability of the ordinance for each matter that is brought to you all to review. So when you do receive these, you're going to be making some of these decisions. So you'll be determining whether there's going to be an order for an upward or a downward adjustment to the rent. You'll be reviewing capital improvements, which are improvements to the property that are not permanent rent increases, but they'll be applied to the rent for a certain amount of time. And then you're also going to be making decisions on relocation assistance. So it's a lot of responsibility, but you do have all of the documents you need to make those sound decisions with the information that you're presented with. And then any other duties as necessary that would fall under the ordinance outside of those main ones that I just mentioned. For the powers and duties of the hearing officer next. So the hearing officer, so you all had your duties, but the hearing officer is contracting with the city of Inglewood to resolve disputes regarding the things that we had just discussed, including the relocation assistance and payments, those rent adjustments, and capital improvement approvals, and recommendations for ordinance exemptions to the board, and any other powers designated by the board. So if you, your specific duties are going to fall primarily under capital improvements, but you will potentially see all of the other items that we discussed previously and have to make decisions on those.
So per the ordinance, as again is regulated for the Rental Protection Board, and is that it's a 5-member board. They are appointed by the respective districts. So two tenants from districts 3 and 4, 2 landlords that are being identified by District 1 and 2, and the City of Inglewood employee, which is nominated by the mayor, serves as chair of the board. Every board typically has officers which are responsible for conducting the meetings, and usually there is a chair and there is a vice chair. The chair is the presiding officer, and again, that is the city employee who's been appointed by the mayor. And typically the presiding officer is the one who is managing your agenda, which the format which we'll talk about is set in your bylaws. They are dealing with and approving on the notifications of the items that are, and authorizing any special meetings. And we'll talk about special meetings a little bit versus your standard regular meeting is what it's called, and then special meetings, and we'll talk about that. And submit recommendations and information relevant to the board affairs. The chair at the end of the conclusions of a hearing or dialogue is the one who typically then announces the decision of the board based upon the respective votes, and they are the one who executes all formal documents and signs resolutions unless the resolution authorizes a staff member to sign if there's something specific. The vice chair basically steps in the absence of the chairperson, and usually that may occur because the person is absent or unless the chair has a conflict of interest. And again, we'll talk about what constitutes a conflict in this presentation. But that is typically where the vice chair and their roles is upon the absence, and they serve 1-year term, and they may be removed by a board majority vote if it's decided that a different vice chair is to be changed out. Periodically, vacancies occur during the terms of the board members, and depending upon which board member occurs and is tied to those respective districts, then that respective district council person would nominate somebody for consideration that then typically is appointed through that process, and then they would serve the remaining term of whatever is left that was created during that vacancy. So if there was 24 months and someone could only serve 6 months, then the new appointee would have the remaining time frame associated with the term. Absences. Periodically, we can't attend meetings, and it's whether it's an excused absent or a non-excused absence. And so it's really important as if you cannot attend a meeting to please make sure and let the secretary know in advance, because those are typically known as excused absences. Non-excused and failure to notify the secretary constitutes an unexcused absence. And I think what's also important is if you're conducting a meeting and let's say a hearing is being continued to more than one meeting date of the board because you need additional information or whatever the case may be. If a board member misses the initial hearing date, but is available, say, for the continuation hearing for the dialogue and ultimate decision, according to your ordinance, the absent board member can participate in the second hearing as long as you have listened to the dialogue, read the material, and then you can participate in the discussion. So that's super important if you're going to miss a meeting to please make sure, and if it's excused, let the secretary know. And if it's a continued hearing, you have an opportunity to participate in the continuation as long as you meet the review of the meeting and relevant documents so that you're up to speed and can then move forward. Is there any questions relative to those set of slides? So unlike many boards and commissions, let me ask, for those of you, how many participate on boards or have experience working on boards in their current or past lives? Just curious. Okay, and then you may have heard of Robert's Rules of Order, and it has a very formal process. Well, what's different is this is a city board and it's regulated by the Brown Act. So there's a little bit of nuances that are different. And the purpose of the Brown Act is to provide a transparent dialogue so that the public has the ability to participate, to be able to read the same material that you receive, to be able to come and attend a hearing and to listen and to be able to provide testimony, whether it's during your public comment period or comment on an item or provide written testimony. And the Brown Act has been modified a couple different times because they want to make sure that decisions are occurring in the hearing and that they're not decisions in which there are people having what's called serial meetings outside where there's two of you talking and then another two people, and it creates like a serial dialogue. So it's really tied to being respectful of having dialogue at the hearing. And so again, it's transparency and access for the public. It's documented. Any information that you get typically are public records. So all of those hearings and your backup documentations and your staff reports, those are all part of the transparency associated with the Brown Act. And it also has meeting requirements in relationship to you have regular meetings and special meetings. So the secretary and the city have to adhere to the ability to post your agendas in accordance to your regular meeting timeframes or for special meetings, and again, to make the information public from that standpoint. And again, the whole purpose is really for advance noticing and transparent dialogue in the decision-making process. And there's very few times in which boards can go into closed session, and those are regulated by the Brown Act as well. And that's usually relative to litigation, personnel issues, and real estate negotiations. So probably relative to the board, you may have very limited times in which most of your dialogue is probably going to be occurring in your actual board meetings, whether you're regular meeting or not. So going into meetings, in your bylaws, you establish a regularly scheduled meeting date and time, and that gets posted, and typically there is a time frame associated with when that information gets available. So that will be one of the actions when you're establishing a new board, and that is established by resolution. It is not in the ordinance because an ordinance requires a whole significant process, because let's say you decide that you need to change the regular meeting date and time, it just takes an action of your board. That's why it's always included in resolutions. If it was in the ordinance, that would take an action of the city council and requires a whole different process. So this gives you and the staff the latitude to be able to provide and schedule regularly scheduled meetings based upon what works for you. Special meetings are typically maybe at the direction of the chair and the staff or a board majority. Those have 24-hour notices, and typically you may have special meetings because there's a deadline that you need to meet that the regularly scheduled meeting doesn't accomplish. So let's say you needed to hold 2 hearings within the same month. One may be at your regularly scheduled meeting and the other is at the special meeting, because let's say you have a time frame in which you are trying to accomplish, or there may be other reasons on creating special meetings, but your time frame's shorter. And it's equally important that no matter if it's a regular meeting or a special meeting, you have to follow the Brown Act. Your secretary and the city staff have to do the postings, make the agendas available in accordance to the time frame. And for the purposes of your board, being a 5-member board, 3 members constitutes a quorum. And to have a decision pass, it needs 3 affirmative votes, not just 3 votes, 3 affirmative votes. Your agendas, this just kind of distinguishes for you the difference between a regular housing board meeting and a special board meeting. Typically your staff that is staffing the board prepares your agendas and your board packets. Many times the staff meets with the chair in advance to make sure that they're fine, just like they may do with the mayor of here's the agenda before it gets posted, and does some briefings. And then typically you are required by the Brown Act on regular meetings to have the 72 hours advance posting of your agenda. Doesn't necessarily mean that the detail of the packet has to be available in 72 hours. That may at times come the day of the meeting, but the agenda and what is going to be discussed and the recommendations is what has to be posted within 72 hours. In relationship to special board meetings, that's where, again, you may have a special topic or something of urgency that you need to add, and that's where you have a 24-hour meeting requirement of posting. This is created out of your bylaws. Your bylaws, again, which you adopt, establishes the order of how your board conducts its meetings. And so based upon your established bylaws, then this outlays exactly what you will see every agenda of what will happen on any given day. You may not necessarily have an item for each, or you may not necessarily have a staff report or whatever for each of them, but at least you're going to see that that's your standard format. So again, the board conducts all of your meetings Brown Act compliant, both the board and the staff. Your housing service director designates who the recording secretary is per the ordinance. There's always a roll call and for requesting for votes of the board. If you don't answer, then they assume it's the affirmative A, because many times they may have an individual roll call, or it depends on the process that they will use. And every member is entitled to a vote unless you are disqualified by a conflict of interest. And usually conflict of interest is something, there's a list in the code of what conflicts are, but many times it's related to investments that you have. It's all about, is there a personal gain to you financially? And usually that is the basis for a conflict of interest. So if you're a tenant and a tenant petition comes forward, or a landlord petition in your park, that would constitute a conflict of interest, or vice versa if you're a landlord and you have a petition that is moving forward. Typically, you when you have a conflict, you declare it, and then you usually leave the room. It's not just leave the dais, but you usually leave the room so that the remaining board members aren't necessarily influenced by or anyone in the audience in relationship. Doesn't mean you can't listen if it's being published, but you physically leave the dais. And unless stating as an abstaining from an item, again, your silence is recorded as a vote with the majority. A tie vote shall be lost motions and may be considered if permitted under law. And different from the Brown Act too, is like your board chair can actually make a motion. I mean, that is in accordance with the Brown Act. Robert's Rules of Order, usually the chair cannot motion. But in the case of the Brown Act, the chair can make a motion for an item that you are hearing. And then this just kind of lays out your rules of procedure and talks about it again. So this is, and sometimes this gets confusing because usually it's like you have to get a motion on the floor. And then once the motion is made, that is when the debate occurs between the council members or questions that you may have. So it's like, what is it that is the motion before you? and then the ability to then have dialogue after that motion occurs. So, and again, as I mentioned, the chairperson has the right to make or second a motion. It sounds like I'm saying emotion, a motion, which again is different from Robert's Rules of Order. That your vote is affirmative when a motion is approved in the matter for the board based upon the majority. That the next item really lays out what your decision-making processes are tied to, which is tied to the ordinance that Jessica reviewed with you on tenant petitions, what aspects relative to the no fault eviction process of what would come before you. And we talked a little bit about what may come directly to the hearing officer and what comes to may come by the board, whether through appeal or because the board has chosen to hear that application or item directly. Disqualified members, again, it's not to be counted as part of the quorum, and it's considered absent, but it's considered approved absent. Deliberations and actions of the board occur only during public meetings and hearings, and this again gets into not having discussion outside of the board meeting on a specific topic, because there's Brown Act issues and also appearance issues. And so we want to make sure that all dialogue is occurring in open meetings. And board members are required to adhere to the current version of the City of Inglewood's city charter, and obviously in accordance with the ordinance and the codes. This gets into kind of what's meant by serial meetings, and it's called ex parte communications. So again, this is where you shouldn't discuss matters outside the board. You may be attending, a chamber event and you have an item forthcoming. You really should not talk about that item. And again, the serial meetings is if, let's say, Maria is talking to Jacob one-on-one, and then at another meeting, she is talking to Benice, did I say that correctly? That constitutes a serial meeting because you have the ability of kind of this tangential dialogue. So that's why it's highly recommended. Do not talk about items before you, either amongst yourself or also with people who may come before you in relationship to the item that has an interest. It's always good for them to be able to come and either provide something in writing to the secretary or to come for the item itself that's heard as part of your public hearing process. And then when you have breaks, it's equally good to not have dialogue with whomever is here, who may want to chat with you and try to influence your vote. That's why we have a very set protocols that take place, similar to what you see if you're on other boards or commissions, or if you've attended planning commission or city council meetings. But again, pleasantries and greetings are fine, but not discussions on the item before you. And then your goal is to maintain neutrality, assuming you don't have a conflict of interest, because if you did, you would be you would be telling the secretary and the board that you have a conflict, and you would be physically removing yourself from the dialogue. So your goal is to sit there and to listen to the information that is provided to you and what is presented, to ask questions, to look at the ordinance, and look at the provisions so that you can make a decision based upon the set of facts and the testimony that comes before you. So, and again, all of this done is during the meeting. Ideally, cell phones on vibrate, because that can create problems and concerns about what may be going back and forth. And again, we kind of talked about where everything's based upon the documentation, your dialogue, and whatnot. And then whether questioning the landlord's a tenant, remember the tone. It's of being neutral, be cognizant of the typical, body language and tone, which displays, so that you're promoting the ability for people to participate and not, and to be heard.
So now we're going to get into the petitions and appeals hearing process. So for petition hearings, we're going to walk through some of the key components of the petition hearing process as it relates to the board and the program administrator. administrator. Firstly, the board retains the authority, as we stated before, to hold a hearing on any petition directly, without requiring it to be first heard by the hearing officer. So this just gives you the assurance that you can address some of those high priority, complex petitions immediately if you see it necessary. So in the cases where the hearing officer is involved and issues their decision, that decision is not final. It could be appealed to the board. This provides an additional layer of review and oversight. When it comes to capital improvement petitions, the board is mandated to hear these cases directly, and this ensures that matters affecting some of the substantial investments and the changes for various rental units are given the appropriate level of attention immediately. So the whole process starts with the program administrator, and they're responsible for determining the eligibility of each of the petitions that's submitted. So only if a petition is deemed eligible and complete will they be accepted into the rest of the process. Once the petition is accepted, it has to be scheduled for a hearing within a specific time frame set forth in the ordinance. So that's no less than 15 days and no more than 60 days from the date of acceptance. This time frame gives both parties time to prepare while ensuring a timely resolution. If the board decides to hold a hearing, it is essential that they act as the hearing officer for that case. So you're going to follow all of the hearing officer's roles for those matters that you decide to hear immediately. This means that you'll hear the evidence and the arguments from both parties. It's important to note that once the board makes its final decision, that decision is final and is not subject to further appeal, and both parties have if they feel that that decision's flawed or unfair, they can seek legal judicial remedies through the courts. But there is no process internally where they can appeal after your decision. So this slide is an outline of the key aspects for the appeals process. So when a decision of the hearing officer is challenged by the board, and that's the only time, the board has the authority to hear the appeals resulting from the hearing officer's decisions. It's important that you remember that for the appeals to be considered, the appealing party must file the appeal within 30 days following that decision. So this deadline is really to make sure that the appeals are timely and that we keep moving along with the case without unnecessary delays. So once the appeal is filed, the program administrator is going to take immediate action. This is a very fast process. So within 5 business days of the filing, the program administrator will notify the board and all of the parties involved, and they're going to keep everyone informed of the appeal. And the standard of review is that they have to be based on substantial evidence. So the program administrator is going to be reviewing the appeal to make sure that it meets the threshold that they consider to be substantial to have that appeal heard. So you're going to focus on whether the original decision by the hearing officer was supported by enough credible evidence. So in the cases where there's multiple appeals, say there's multiple units with the same owner, the same property owner or landlord, the board or the program administrator can decide to consolidate all the appeals at once. And then it will streamline and avoid redundancy and extra work for you all. The program administrator plays a key role in preparing the case for the board's review. So staff is working hard to review all of not only the petitions that come in, but any of the appeals. They're working under very tight deadlines, and they're reviewing it for completeness and accepting these and in some cases preparing staff reports for you all to consider all of the evidence presented and packaging it nicely for you. So it's a lot of hard work that goes into preparing for that appeal process. And in order to ensure continued transparency, which is the whole point of your role, is to allow adequate time for review. All of the materials for supporting the appeal must be made available at least 72 hours before the regular scheduled board meeting that will be hearing the appeal.
And can I just add one thing? You're not conducting a whole new hearing as though you're redoing the hearing of the hearing officer. You're looking at anything that's new. And that's why you're looking at the old testimony and then seeing what additional information is being provided. So you're not conducting a new hearing from scratch.
And that, yeah, thank you for that. That goes back to supporting the substantial evidence that the program administrator is going to be reviewing. If they're saying, I appeal it, I want it to be looked at again, they have to point to reasons why they believe that it was wrong. The decision should not stand. So you wouldn't have to look at all of the materials again. You would be reviewing the staff report and all of the decisions from the hearing officer. Thank you for pointing that out.
And then one other thing to point out regarding the 30-day appeal period. So if an item is heard by the hearing officer and they do not appeal within 30 days, then the hearing officer's decision stands. And then if they wanted, their next recourse would be judicial remedy. Similar to if you heard it first as the board, it's not appealable. So that 30-day time frame is crucial in relationship, both for staff management perspective and what may come before you.
Thank you. Yeah, so overall it's just designed for transparency and to keep the process moving along for all of the board members and for the staff who's doing a lot of the heavy lifting for this part and for the initial review of those petitions that come in. Next one. All right, so speaking of what's to come, this was just a high-level overview of touching upon petitions and appeals, the process. But we're going to get more, we're going to go deeper into the landlord petitions and the tenant petitions in their own modules, because there's so much information for all of you to hear about each of the petition types and what is required for each of them and what your role is when you review them, that they have their own training module. So we do want to just remind you that we'll present it in a way that you can see when it comes through who is it going to first. But I think the big takeaway is that everything is going to start with the hearing officer except capital improvements, which would go directly to the board, unless the board is hearing it, is making the decision to hear it instead of the hearing officer. And then for the last slide is just contact information for the individuals. I'm sure you already have this, but just in case, we have it available on this last slide.